Have you got no clue how to use a fluffy yarn that you've got in your stash? Well, this is going to be the video for you, where you can take a look at the different kinds of fluffy yarns there are and get some ideas on how to use them, and also ways of avoiding problems with ripping. So let's go check this video out now. Over the last few years, there has been quite a craze in terms of fluffy yarns or brushed yarns in your stash. Generally speaking, most people associate those with mohair, but it can actually be a variety of other types of fibers that will be included in it. But the most common does tend to be mohair. But they can be a little tricky to work with, and it can be hard to figure out how best to incorporate them into your knitting. So the main way you're probably going to see them is in mohair. So this one is capriccio, and these are all going to be their lace weight yarn, so very, very fine. But the brush means that even though the middle strand is very small, there's a big halo of yarn around it. So they're a little deceptive, because you can knit them very loosely and that brush or the halo fills in all of the space it around. So they're very, very good for knitting at a very loose gauge, basically. You're not usually going to have 100% mohair. More often they're going to be mixed with different things. Like this one here, the capriccio, is mixed with polyamide. I have got another one here from Cowgirl Blues, and well, the hint is in the name. It's called Kid Silk. So this one, it's got silk and mohair. Let me have a look to see what the percentage is. 70% mohair and 30% silk. So it's going to give you quite a luxurious fabric. You will notice as well that mohair, it is not as soft always as you expect it to be. Like some of them, particularly the kid ones, are going to be a little softer, but mohair, if you use non-kid silk mohair, can actually be a little bit on the rougher side, because it tends to have, the fibers tend to poke out a little bit with it. So keep an eye out for that when you pick it up. Have a feel for it to see how soft it is, because when we see something that fluffy, our immediate assumption is that it's super soft, but it's not always the case. The other thing about mohair is that it's something that can trigger allergies. Like, I know it's probably up there in terms of allergic reaction. So before you invest in a lot of expensive mohair, see if you can get a small sample, knit it up, and perhaps put it next to your skin. Just kind of put it under a sleeve or around your neck for a little bit to see if you get a reaction to it. Sometimes people, even knitting it, will end up with a reaction from the knitting process. So if it's giving you a reaction, or maybe it's making you sneeze, then you may want to start looking at alternatives. So if you still really like the idea of a brushed yarn, because it does really enhance the work, then something like what we have here, which is our cumulus, is going to be really, really useful for you. So this one, it's 74% baby Suri alpaca. So alpaca, you're much less likely to react to, but it's going to actually create that same lovely brushed bloom to it. And the rest of it then is 26% silk. So very luxurious fiber, alpaca silk, and it is softer than the mohair blend. Now, it's not quite as fine, so in some cases that could be an advantage, but the central core is a little bit thicker on this. This is cumulus. So it means that you're going to get a thicker fabric if you're combining with other things. I'm just pausing the video for a second to remind you to pop in and subscribe. It is one of the best ways of making sure that you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. But now, back to the videos. Worked by itself, you're probably going to be able to get away with it. It won't be too bad. So that's the brushed alpaca family. And then just mohair by itself, there you can have it combined with a lot of other yarns, such as this is our jas yarn, and it has got some mohair added into it. So for the most part, it feels very much like wool. But if you hold it in the side, you'll see there's a little bit more hairiness, or a slight different fiber comes into it. I do find that mohair added into garments it doesn't add any weight. It's quite a light fiber, but it considerably increases the warmth of it. So it's very, very good for anything where you want to have something that's not too heavy and not too thick, but still feels nice and warm. So this one has just 14% mohair, so it's not a really, really heavy mohair content. So even if you've got, if you have a slight reaction to mohair, it might be worth testing when you've got a lower amount like this, because often I find that people can still tolerate a percentage like this. So don't totally discount it if you react to the other kind of mohair, something that's 70% mohair. So that's kind of how mohair fits together, different ways of seeing it. And the next thing is how you use it and what kind of patterns it works in. And I suppose also how you would rip it out, because that's the big elephant in the room with mohair, is that if you make a mistake, it tends to stick onto each other. So actually pulling that out can be quite tricky. So, but first of all, we look at patterns. You can take a look on my website, the patterns that I've got here, you can actually see and different ways that I've used it. For the most part, I've used it with shawls. So this one is the Green Cluck shawl, which is the most recent knit along in 2024, was the Green Cluck shawl knit along. And in that one, we've combined a 4-ply fingering yarn alternating with the lace weight. So obviously with the lace weight is a mohair, a very open brushed mohair. We're using the same needle size and we're working towards having the same gauge. And what that means is that you end up, for the parts where, let me hold it up here, where there's mohair, you have a very, very open, transparent feel to it that gives it a very, very light, airy effect. It's even more enhanced in these sections here where we've done drop stitches. So, but again, as we were saying, when you've got a brushed fabric like that, it means that it will open up and fill in all of those spaces, so it doesn't feel like there's gaps in it or that you're knitting it that loosely. There is another shawl here that was from a couple of years ago. This is Quilted Feather, and it's again a 4-ply and it's combined with a brushed yarn. This one was Cumulus. There were other versions that people use, Capriccio, which is the mohair one. You can see this is a little thicker, and for this the edging has all been knit on from side to side with that yarn, and it's using kind of an open back and forth pattern where you're doing very, very extended stitches and then crisscrossing them as cables. So it adds a little bit more density than you typically see with this, but still keeps it very, very light and fluffy, and kind of gives a lovely contrast to a solid background with a more woolly 4-ply. So you can see here, when you've got that brush coming across the surface for the quilted effects, you've got drop stitches where they're picked up periodically, and having a different fabric type means that it really, really stands out and creates a big difference in both the contrast as well as the color. So if you're looking for a yarn where you just want that brushed yarn to play a backup or a secondary role, look for patterns like this where it can really stand out or jump out from the second yarn you're using in the pattern. So this is, those are examples in, like in shawls, where you're using it as a second yarn and it's being used by itself. The other one I've got an example of here is our Iascora sweater. So this is a brioche sweater, and it's actually very warm, and you can see it creates this lovely, lovely halo of work. And that's done by taking a very light fingering single ply yarn, which is our Blosta Light over here, this one. So it's a woolen spun yarn. It's a fairly fine yarn, and it's quite delicate because it's a single ply woolen spun. But mohair does tend to be really strong, so this makes it a lovely match. So you take one of these, one strand of that, and hold the whole thing stranded out throughout the whole thing. So it means you get a warm fabric. It's not too heavy and it's not too thick, because both of them are so fine, and you get a very, very beautiful halo going on. So that's actually probably where you've seen most of these brushed mohairs being combined all the way through, is being held double with a fingering yarn. That it works very well in brioche. You can use it for standard knitting as well, but brioche is where you're more likely to see it. It's much more common. So going back to the fixing mistakes in mohair, particularly if you've got ones where it's just mohair being worked, and there's a couple of different ways that can kind of help you. I mean, the first thing is, no matter what you do, it is tricky to rip out stitches with mohair. So what I end up doing is, I will kind of, if there's several rows that I have to go down, I'll take the needles off and I'll very slowly pull those stitches out. Because of the fact that it sticks together, they have a tendency, you have to be careful because it can pull down a lot of rows as you're working. So I'll do the best to pull out the first few, and then the last few rows I will just individually put my needle into it and then pull it out. So put my needle into the row below and then pull out that next stitch. Another tip that I haven't tried before that is probably worth it if you've got a lot to rip is putting your work into the freezer. So put it into the freezer before you rip. Apparently it means that they tend to adhere a little less to each other. So if you have quite a bit to rip out with mohair, it might be worth testing that and seeing how it goes. But the main thing working with mohair, either knitting the stitches or ripping it out, is you just have to go slowly. You just take it one stitch at a time, and it is delicate, it's more likely to snag, so it just requires you to slow down and enjoy the process and enjoy the feel of the actual yarn. So enjoy your mohair and take your time.